The gunshot echoed across the empty plains, startling Penelope right from her fitful sleep. She clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma to her chest, heart hammering as she peered through the tattered canvas of the covered wagon. Outside, the darkness of the Montana Territory night concealed whatever danger lurked beyond. April 1872 had brought nothing but misery since her husband Thomas fell ill with fever 3 weeks into their journey west. Now he was gone, buried beneath a crude wooden cross 2 days' ride back, leaving Penelope alone with their baby daughter, a nearly empty wagon and dwindling supplies. "Hush now, little one," she whispered as Emma began to fuss. The April night was cold, and the thin blanket did little to keep them warm. Their oxen had wandered off during the night Thomas died, and Penelope had been stranded here for 3 days, watching their food supplies dwindle while gathering what courage she could to continue on foot. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Penelope reached for the small revolver Thomas had insisted she learn to use. Her hands trembled as she checked that it was loaded, just as he had taught her. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm armed and I know how to shoot." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whimpering of Emma and the whisper of prairie grass moving in the night breeze. "Madam," a deep voice called from the darkness. "Don't shoot. I'm just passing through. Heard your wagon and thought someone might be in trouble." Penelope tightened her grip on the revolver. "Stay where you are. I can see just fine." A match struck, illuminating the weathered face of a man perhaps in his early 30s. He stood several yards from the wagon, his other hand raised in a gesture of peace. Behind him, a horse nickered softly. "Name's Matthew Blackwood," he said, letting the match burn down. "I was tracking some cattle rustlers. Those shots you heard were them taking off with a few head of my employer's stock." He struck another match. "Looks like you're having some trouble of your own." The light revealed a tall man with broad shoulders and a face tanned from years under the sun. His dark hair was partially covered by a worn Stetson, and a week's worth of beard shadowed his jawline. Despite his rough appearance, there was something in his eyes that didn't speak of danger. "My husband died," Penelope found herself saying, though she kept the gun trained on him. "Fever took him. Our oxen wandered off." Matthew nodded slowly. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, madam. It's no place for a woman alone." His eyes shifted to the bundle in her arms. "And a little one too, I see." "We're managing," Penelope said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I don't mean to impose, but there's a storm coming in from the north. I can smell it." He glanced at the sky. "You can shoot me if you want, but I'd feel better knowing you had proper shelter and food before I move on." Emma began to cry in earnest now, her tiny face scrunched up in hunger and discomfort. Penelope hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, saving what little food remained for the milk she needed to produce for her daughter. "I don't need charity," she said, even as her stomach growled loudly enough for him to hear. Matthew's face softened. "It's not charity, madam. It's being human. My camp is about a mile from here. Got coffee brewing and rabbit stew on the fire. You're welcome to share it, and I'll help you figure out what to do come morning." Penelope looked down at Emma, then back at Matthew. The night was growing colder, and the prospect of warm food made her resolve waver. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked. Matthew extinguished his match and slowly removed his gun belt, placing it on the ground. "You keep that revolver pointed at me the whole time if it makes you feel safer. I'll walk ahead. You follow at whatever distance feels right." He stepped back. "But we should go soon." "That storm won't wait on our deliberations." Penelope weighed her options. Stay here with a hungry baby in a broken-down wagon with a storm approaching, or take a chance on this stranger who seemed decent enough to disarm himself. "Let me gather a few things," she finally said. 10 minutes later, Penelope was following Matthew through the darkness, Emma bundled against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from a shawl. She carried her revolver in one hand and a small bag of their remaining possessions in the other. Matthew led his horse, having insisted she not walk the full mile in her weakened state. His camp was tucked into a small grove of cottonwoods near a creek. A small fire burned cheerfully, and the promised stew bubbled in a cast iron pot hanging above it. The scent made Penelope's mouth water. "Please sit," Matthew said, gesturing to a fallen log he'd positioned as a bench. "I'll dish up some food." Penelope sank down gratefully, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby had quieted, perhaps sensing the change in their circumstances. Matthew handed her a tin plate of stew and a chunk of cornbread. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." Penelope balanced the plate on her knee, still keeping her revolver close. "Thank you. You got a name?" he asked, serving himself and sitting on a saddle he'd placed across from her. "Penelope Wright, and this is Emma." She took a bite of the stew and nearly moaned at the taste. It was the first proper food she'd had in days. Matthew nodded. "Heading somewhere in particular, Mrs. Wright?" "Penny is fine," she said, surprising herself with the informality. "We were bound for Helena. Thomas, my husband, had a cousin there who offered him work in his mercantile." "Helena's still a good 70 miles northwest," Matthew said. "Not an easy journey on foot with a child." Penelope's shoulders slumped. "I know, I don't know what else to do." Matthew studied her for a moment. "I work at the Lazy R Ranch about 15 miles from here. Owner's a fair man named Robert Rankin. He might have work you could do cooking or laundry maybe, at least until you can decide your next step." "I couldn't impose. It's not imposing if you're earning your keep," Matthew interrupted gently. "And winter's not fully gone from these parts. That little one needs a roof overhead." As if to emphasize his point, a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. Emma startled at the noise, and Penelope rocked her gently. "The storm's moving in faster than I thought," Matthew said, glancing at the sky. "We should get under better shelter." He moved quickly, erecting a small canvas tent and building up the fire. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, he had created a snug shelter. "You and the little one take the tent," he said. "I'll keep watch by the fire under that overhang." Penelope hesitated. She was exhausted, and the thought of lying down properly was tempting. "I give you my word as a man, Mrs. Wright. Penny, I mean you no harm," Matthew said, seeming to read her thoughts. "I lost my sister and her child to fever 2 years back. Couldn't do anything to help them then. Maybe I can help you now." Something in his voice, a genuine grief, made Penelope believe him. She nodded slowly and crawled into the tent, taking Emma with her. The ground inside had been padded with a thick bedroll, and Matthew had placed his spare blanket inside. Penelope laid Emma down beside her and finally allowed herself to relax slightly, the revolver still within reach. Outside, she could hear Matthew moving around, securing things against the intensifying storm. The rain began to drum steadily on the canvas, a surprisingly comforting sound. Emma's breathing had deepened into sleep, and Penelope found her own eyes growing heavy. For the first time since Thomas had drawn his last breath, she felt something close to safe. As sleep claimed her, Penelope wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether she had made the right choice in trusting this quiet cowboy with the kind eyes. Morning came with clear skies and the smell of coffee. Penelope awoke disoriented, then remembered the events of the night before. Emma was still sleeping soundly beside her, and Penelope took a moment to check on her before emerging from the tent. Matthew crouched by the fire, poking at something in a skillet. He looked up as she approached. "Morning," he said. "Hope you slept well. Got some bacon and biscuits here." "Thank you," Penelope said, smoothing her rumpled dress. She felt self-conscious in the daylight, aware of her disheveled appearance after days on the trail. "And thank you for last night. I'm not sure we would have fared well in that storm." Matthew nodded. "Storm passed through quick. Should be good traveling weather." He handed her a tin mug of coffee. "Have you given any thought to my suggestion about the ranch?" Penelope cradled the mug in her hands, savoring its warmth. "I have, I think. I think it might be our best option for now. If you're certain your employer wouldn't mind." Old man Rankin's gruff but fair. "Ranch could use a woman's touch in the kitchen. Current cook is Jeremiah, and while he means well, his biscuits could double as horseshoes." Matthew's mouth quirked in a half-smile. A small cry from the tent announced Emma's awakening. Penelope hurried to retrieve her daughter, bringing her back to the fire. "She's a pretty little thing," Matthew observed as Penelope settled with Emma in her arms. "She has her father's eyes," Penelope said softly, a pang of grief hitting her anew. "He was so proud when she was born." Matthew nodded, giving her the space to feel her loss without empty words of comfort. Instead, he dished up a plate of food and set it within her reach. "I need to retrieve what I can from our wagon," Penelope said after feeding Emma and eating her own breakfast. "There's not much, but there are some things I couldn't carry last night." "We'll head there first, then make for the ranch," Matthew agreed. "I have some burlap sacks we can use to carry your belongings." An hour later, they stood beside Penelope's abandoned wagon. In the daylight, it looked even more forlorn than she remembered, one wheel completely broken, the canvas torn from the harsh prairie winds. Matthew helped her gather what was salvageable. Some clothing, a family Bible, Thomas's pocket watch, a small wooden chest containing a few pieces of her mother's silver, and a rag doll meant for Emma when she was older. Penelope paused at the driver's seat where Thomas had sat, his face flushed with fever during those final days. She ran her hand over the worn wood, saying a silent goodbye. "You ready?" Matthew asked gently. Penelope nodded, adjusting Emma in her sling. "Yes, there's nothing more for us here." Matthew had fashioned a better carrying sling for Emma that attached to Penelope's front, leaving her hands free. He helped her mount his horse, then began leading them northeast toward the Lazy R Ranch. As they traveled, Matthew pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his 8 years in the Montana Territory. He'd come west from Pennsylvania after the war, seeking a fresh start away from too many painful memories. "Lost my parents to typhoid when I was 16, he explained. "Joined the Union Army at 17. After Gettysburg, I'd seen enough of death to last a lifetime." "Thomas was in the war too," Penelope said. "When he came home to Ohio, he was different, quieter. That's when he started talking about heading west, making a fresh start." "It changes a man," Matthew agreed. "But out here, there's space to breathe. Room to put those memories somewhere they don't haunt you quite so much." They stopped midday to rest and water the horse. Matthew produced jerky and dried apples from his saddlebags, which they shared in the shade of a solitary pine tree. "How long have you worked at the Lazy R?" Penelope asked. "Going on 5 years now. Started as just another hand, worked my way up to foreman last year." There was a hint of pride in his voice. "Rankin's getting on in years. His son shows no interest in ranching, went east to become a banker." Matthew shook his head as if he couldn't fathom choosing ledgers over open skies. "And there's housing for the workers?" Penelope asked, her practical mind turning to their immediate needs. Bunkhouse for the single men. A few small cabins for married hands. Matthew hesitated. "There's an unused cabin that used to belong to the previous foreman before he moved into town. It's small but solid. Might need some fixing up, but it would give you and Emma privacy." Penelope looked at him sharply. I couldn't take your cabin, Matthew shrugged. It's not mine. I stay in the bunkhouse with the men, easier to keep an eye on things that way. Cabin's just sitting empty, collecting dust. They resumed their journey, and by late afternoon, the landscape began to change. The open prairie gave way to more varied terrain, with rolling hills and scattered stands of pine and aspen. In the distance, snow-capped mountains rose against the blue sky. That's the Rankin land you're looking at, Matthew said, gesturing to the vast expanse before them. Runs from the foothills there all the way to the creek will cross about a mile ahead. Penelope was impressed by the scale. The Lazy R was clearly a substantial operation. As they drew closer, she could make out cattle grazing on the hillsides, and eventually, the buildings of the ranch headquarters came into view. The main house was a large, two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Behind it stood a large barn, corrals, a bunkhouse, and several smaller cabins scattered at respectful distances. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and men moved about the yard, leading horses or carrying supplies. As they approached, several of the ranch hands stopped to watch, curiosity evident on their faces. It wasn't every day their foreman returned with a woman and child in tow. An older man emerged from the main house, standing on the porch with hands braced on the railing. Even from a distance, his commanding presence was evident. "That's Robert Rankin," Matthew said quietly. "Let me do the talking at first." He helped Penelope dismount when they reached the yard, ensuring she was steady on her feet with Emma secure in her sling before approaching the porch. "Blackwood," Rankin called, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Thought you were tracking those rustlers. Lost their trail in the storm last night, sir," Matthew replied. "But I found something else that needed attention." He gestured to Penelope. "This is Mrs. Penelope Wright and her daughter Emma. Her husband passed recently on the trail to Helena. I found them stranded with a broken wagon and no team." Rankin's weathered face softened slightly as he looked at Penelope and the baby. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, though sharp, held no malice. "Sorry for your troubles, Mrs. Wright," he said. "Montana territory isn't forgiving to those unprepared for its challenges." "Thank you, Mr. Rankin," Penelope replied, lifting her chin slightly. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not looking for charity. Mr. Blackwood suggested you might have work I could do. I'm a good cook and can handle laundry, mending, and most household tasks." A hint of approval flickered across Rankin's face at her directness. "That's so. Our current cook's better with horses than biscuits, I'll grant you that." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "But a ranch is no place for a woman alone with a child." "If I may, sir," Matthew interjected. "The old foreman's cabin is still vacant. Mrs. Wright could stay there, take over kitchen duties, perhaps help Mrs. Peterson with the laundry. Might be good for morale to have decent food again." Rankin considered this, his eyes never leaving Penelope's face. "You ever cooked for a dozen hungry men before, Mrs. Wright?" "I ran a boarding house in Cincinnati for 3 years before my marriage," Penelope answered. 15 permanent residents plus daily customers. I can handle hungry men, Mr. Rankin." This brought a small smile to the older man's face. "Is that right? Well then," he turned to Matthew. "Show Mrs. Wright to the cabin, get her settled. She can start in the kitchen tomorrow if she's willing. We'll try this arrangement for 2 weeks. If it works, we'll discuss more permanent terms." "Thank you, sir," Penelope said, relief washing over her. "You won't regret it," Rankin nodded. "See that I don't." He turned to go back inside, then paused. "Blackwood, once you've got Mrs. Wright situated, come see me. Need to discuss those rustlers." Matthew led Penelope across the yard toward a small cabin set apart from the others. It stood near a stand of aspens with a small porch and chimney. Though weathered, it appeared solid and well-built. "It's not much," Matthew said as they approached, "but it's sturdy. Good roof, tight windows. No leaks that I know of." The interior was dusty but basically sound: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. A door led to a smaller bedroom at the back. "Previous foreman was a widower," Matthew explained. "This was his daughter's room before she married and moved to Virginia City." The smaller room contained a narrow bed frame with no mattress and a simple dresser. A window looked out toward the mountains. "It's perfect," Penelope said, emotion suddenly tightening her throat. After days of uncertainty and fear, the simple cabin seemed like a palace. "It needs a good cleaning," Matthew observed, running a finger through the dust on the mantel. "And that stove should be checked before you use it. I'll send Jimmy over, he's good with that sort of thing, and we'll need to get you a mattress for that bed frame." "I can manage with blankets for now," Penelope said. "You've already done so much." Matthew shook his head. "You'll need proper rest if you're cooking for this crew." "I'll have one brought over from the storage loft." He hesitated. "There's a trunk of linens in the main house that belonged to Mrs. Rankin. She passed 3 years ago. I'm sure Mr. Rankin wouldn't mind you using them." Penelope nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Matthew, truly." He seemed momentarily flustered by her gratitude. "Just doing what anyone would," he said, adjusting his hat. "I should go see Mr. Rankin. I'll send over some supplies to get you started: firewood, water, something for supper. Kitchen duties won't start until tomorrow." After Matthew left, Penelope stood in the center of the cabin, Emma sleeping peacefully against her chest, and allowed herself a moment of quiet relief. They had shelter. They had the promise of work. It wasn't what she had planned when she and Thomas set out from Ohio, but it was something. A beginning. By nightfall, the cabin had been transformed. True to his word, Matthew had sent Jimmy, a lanky teenager with a gift for mechanics, to check the stove and chimney. He'd also brought buckets of water, an armload of firewood, and a broom. Several of the other ranch hands had stopped by, each bringing something useful: a jar of preserved peaches, a sack of coffee beans, a small rocking chair that someone's wife had left behind years ago. Mrs. Peterson, the laundress who lived in town but came to the ranch 3 times a week, had arrived with a basket containing clean linens, a loaf of bread, and a small jar of honey. Matthew returned as Penelope was settling Emma into a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer padded with blankets. He carried a proper mattress on his shoulder and a box of supplies in his free arm. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting down the box. "Some basic provisions to get you through until tomorrow. And the mattress from the storage loft, it's clean, been wrapped up tight." Together they fitted the mattress onto the bed frame in the main room. Matthew built a fire in the fireplace while Penelope arranged her few possessions around the cabin, trying to make it feel like home. "Kitchen opens at 4:30, Matthew said as he prepared to leave. "Breakfast is served at 5:30. Ranch hands start work at first light." "I'll be ready," Penelope assured him. Matthew paused at the door. "If you need anything during the night, anything at all, the bunkhouse is just beyond the barn. I'm in the small room at the end." "We'll be fine," Penelope said, though she appreciated his concern. "Thank you again, Matthew. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us last night." He nodded, seeming uncomfortable with her thanks. "Get some rest, Penny. Tomorrow we'll come early." After he left, Penelope checked on Emma once more, then sat in the rocking chair by the fire. The events of the past few days washed over her: the loss of Thomas, the fear and uncertainty, and now this unexpected sanctuary. She allowed herself a few quiet tears, for grief and relief mingled together, before finally retiring to bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive. The cabin creaked and settled in ways different from her wagon or her home back in Ohio. The wind whispered through the aspen leaves outside her window, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Yet, beneath the strangeness lay a surprising sense of security. For the first time since Thomas's death, Penelope felt the faintest stirring of hope. Whatever tomorrow brought, they had survived today, and for now that was enough. The first rooster crowed at 4 o'clock, startling Penelope from a deep sleep. For a moment she was disoriented, then remembered where she was. The cabin was chilly, the fire having died down to embers during the night. She checked on Emma, who still slept peacefully, then quickly dressed and rekindled the fire. By the light of a single candle, she washed her face in the basin of water she'd set aside the night before and pinned her hair into a simple bun. At exactly 4:30, there was a quiet knock at her door. Matthew stood outside holding a lantern. "Morning," he said. "Thought I'd walk you to the kitchen your first day. It can be confusing in the dark." "Thank you," Penelope said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Let me just bring Emma." "Actually," Matthew said, "Mrs. Peterson arrived early to help with laundry. She offered to watch the little one while you get breakfast started. She raised 6 of her own, so she knows her way around babies." Penelope hesitated. She hadn't been separated from Emma since her birth. Matthew seemed to understand her reluctance. "She'll bring Emma to the main house once she's awake. You'll be just across the yard." After a moment's consideration, Penelope nodded. "All right, let me just show her where everything is, Mrs." Peterson was a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who shooed away Penelope's concerns with practiced ease. "Go on now, dear. This little angel and I will get along just fine. You've got hungry men to feed." The ranch kitchen was housed in an extension at the back of the main house, a large, functional space with a massive cast iron stove, long preparation tables, and shelves stocked with provisions. A doorway led to a dining room where 3 long tables were arranged to seat the ranch hands. "Jeremiah left everything ready for you," Matthew explained, lighting more lamps to illuminate the space. He was actually relieved to get back to full-time stable duties. Penelope surveyed the kitchen, noting with approval that it was clean and well-organized, if a bit sparse in certain supplies. "This will do nicely," she said, already rolling up her sleeves. "What's the usual breakfast? Coffee, biscuits, sometimes bacon or salt pork, beans most days." Matthew grimaced slightly. "Like I said, Jeremiah's talents lie elsewhere." Penelope's mind was already racing with improvements she could make, even with limited supplies. "I'll need to inventory what's available, but I think we can do better than that. How many am I feeding?" 14 men including me, plus Mr. Rankin and yourself, Mrs. Peterson will take something back for her and Emma." Penelope nodded, already tying an apron around her waist. "I'll manage. You can leave me to it now." Matthew hesitated. "You sure?" "I've run kitchens before, Matthew," she said with a small smile. "This is the part I know how to do." He nodded and left her to her work. Penelope quickly assessed the available ingredients and set to work. She built up the fire in the stove, put coffee on to boil, and began mixing dough for proper biscuits. She found eggs, bacon, and potatoes in the larder, and decided on a hearty breakfast to start her tenure on the right foot. By 5:15, the kitchen was filled with enticing aromas. Penelope had just removed the 3rd batch of biscuits from the oven when the door opened, and Mrs. Peterson entered with Emma, now awake and cooing happily. "Something smells like heaven itself," Mrs. Peterson declared. "Those men won't know what hit them." Penelope quickly washed her hands and took Emma, pressing kisses to her daughter's soft cheeks. "Was she good for you?" "An absolute angel," Mrs. Peterson assured her. "Now put me to work. Those men will be stomping in here any minute, hungry as bears after winter." Together, they finished the preparations, and at exactly 5:30, the ranch hands began filing into the dining room. Their conversations fell silent as they noticed the spread laid out on the table's fluffy biscuits, crisp bacon, eggs scrambled with onions and potatoes, and a pot of beans seasoned more carefully than they were accustomed to. Matthew entered last, alongside Mr. Rankin. The older man's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the food, but he said nothing as he took his seat at the head of the center table. Penelope stood by the kitchen door, Emma on her hip, suddenly nervous as the men looked expectantly at the food and then at her. "Well," Rankin finally said, "let's not let Mrs. Wright's efforts go to waste. Dig in, boys." The next few minutes were filled with the sounds of appreciation as the men helped themselves to the food. Penelope watched anxiously until Matthew caught her eye and gave her a small nod of approval. "Mrs. Wright," Rankin called after his first bite of biscuit, "I believe we've made a fair exchange. You're cooking for shelter." A murmur of agreement ran through the men, and Penelope felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd passed the first test. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Penelope rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, returned to the cabin mid-morning to tend to household tasks and Emma, then back to the kitchen to prepare the midday meal. Afternoons were spent planning the evening meal and beginning preparations, with breaks to care for Emma, who spent part of each day with Mrs. Peterson. The ranch hands were respectful, if a bit shy around her at first. Most were unmarried men in their 20s and 30s, with a few older hands who had been with the Lazy R for decades. They seemed genuinely appreciative of the improvement in their meals, and often complimented her cooking with bashful sincerity. Matthew checked on her several times a day, always finding some reason to stop by the kitchen or her cabin. He fixed loose boards on her porch, repaired a leak in her roof that appeared after a spring rain, and brought wildflowers that Emma could look at from her makeshift cradle. "The men are happier than I've seen them in months," he told her one evening, a week after her arrival. He had stopped by her cabin after dinner, carrying a small wooden horse he'd carved for Emma. "Good food makes for good workers." "I'm glad," Penelope said, inviting him to sit by the fire. "Everyone has been kind. I wasn't sure what to expect. Ranch life can be rough," Matthew acknowledged, "but there's a code out here. You look after your own." He handed her the carved horse. "Thought Emma might like this when she's a bit older, something to play with." Penelope turned the small figure in her hands, admiring the careful craftsmanship. "It's beautiful, Matthew. Thank you." He shrugged, uncomfortable with praise as always. "Just something to pass the time in the evenings." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the fire. Penelope found herself studying Matthew's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. There was something solid about him, dependable in a way that reminded her of Thomas, yet distinctly different. "Mr. Rankin asked me today if you plan to stay on," Matthew said eventually, breaking the silence. "The 2-week trial period is almost up." Penelope had been thinking about this herself. "What did you tell him?" "Said it was your decision to make." Matthew poked at the fire with a stick. "But I told him the men would revolt if you left. Patterson claims your apple pie cured his rheumatism." Penelope laughed. "I doubt that." "You've brought something to this place, Penny," Matthew said, his voice growing serious. "Not just good food, a kind of warmth." Their eyes met across the short distance, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that sent an unexpected flutter through Penelope's chest. She looked away first, suddenly conscious of her position as a recent widow. "I think we will stay," she said softly. "At least for now. Emma is thriving here, and I feel useful again." Matthew nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Good, that's good." He stood, reaching for his hat. "I should let you get some rest. Early start tomorrow." At the door, he paused. "There's a supply wagon heading to Fort Benton next week. I'll be going along to handle some business for Mr. Rankin. If there's anything special you need from town, let me know. Might be able to pick up some things for Emma, too." "Thank you, I will," Penelope said. After he left, she sat for a long time by the fire, the wooden horse still in her hands, trying to sort through the confusing emotions Matthew Blackwood had stirred within her. Spring blossomed fully across the Montana Territory, bringing longer days and the busy season of calving. The ranch hands worked from dawn until well after dusk, and Penelope adjusted her kitchen schedule to ensure they had substantial meals to sustain them through the demanding work. Emma grew stronger each day, her chubby legs kicking excitedly whenever Matthew came to visit, which was increasingly often. He always had some small gift or toy for her, and Emma's face would light up at the sight of him. "She's partial to you," Penelope observed one evening in late May as Matthew sat in the rocking chair with Emma on his knee. He was showing her a small mirror, and she was entranced by her own reflection. "Smart girl," Matthew replied with a grin. "Knows who brings the best presents." Penelope smiled, enjoying the sight of them together. It had been just over a month since Matthew had found them stranded on the prairie, but sometimes it felt like they had known him much longer. "Mr. Rankin mentioned you were an engineer before the war," she said, recalling a conversation from dinner the previous evening. Matthew looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Did he now? The old man doesn't usually share much about his hands." "He said you helped design the new irrigation system for the South pasture, said it was uncommonly clever." Penelope mimicked Rankin's gruff tone. A faint blush colored Matthew's cheeks. "It's just simple hydraulics. My father taught me. He built bridges back in Pennsylvania." "You never mentioned you had formal education," Matthew shrugged. "Doesn't seem important out here. A man is judged by what he can do, not what he knows." "Still," Penelope persisted, "it explains a lot about you." "How so?" He bounced Emma gently on his knee, making her giggle. "The way you assess problems, how you're always figuring out solutions." She gestured around the cabin. "The shelf you built for my cooking supplies, the way you fixed the chimney draft. You see things differently than most men I've known." Now Matthew's blush deepened. "It's nothing special." "I disagree," Penelope said softly. "It is special." Their eyes met again, and that same current passed between them. This time, neither looked away immediately. Emma broke the moment by reaching for Matthew's beard, her tiny fingers grasping at the dark hair with surprising strength. Matthew laughed, gently disentangling her hand. "Strong little lady you've got here. She'll be running circles around us before you know it." "She's already trying to pull herself up on furniture," Penelope said, grateful for the shift in conversation. "I turned my back for 1 second and she's attempting to climb something." "We should build her a proper crib," Matthew said. "That drawer won't contain her much longer." Penelope asked. "I mean I could build it," Matthew corrected himself quickly. "If you'd like." "I would like that," Penelope said. "Very much." The following week, Matthew departed with the supply wagon for Fort Benton. Before leaving, he gave Penelope a list of items he planned to purchase for Emma's crib, asking for her approval. "It's too much, Matthew," she protested when she saw the detailed plans he'd drawn. "The wood alone must be expensive." "I've been saving my wages," he said simply. "Don't have much else to spend them on out here." She couldn't dissuade him, and truthfully, she didn't try very hard. There was something touching about his eagerness to provide for Emma's comfort. The ranch seemed unusually quiet during the 5 days Matthew was gone. Penelope found herself watching the trail for his return, and Emma seemed to sense his absence, growing fussy at the times he would normally visit. When the supply wagon finally returned, Penelope was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She heard the commotion in the yard and peered out the window to see Matthew dismounting from his horse, dusty from the trail but smiling as the other hands greeted him. She busied herself with the meal preparations, telling herself it would be inappropriate to rush out to welcome him back. Yet her heart beat a little faster knowing he had returned safely. Later that evening, after dinner had been served and the kitchen cleaned, there was a knock at her cabin door. Matthew stood there with several packages in his arms. "Special delivery," he announced with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Emma's just fallen asleep, but I know she'll be excited to see you tomorrow." Matthew set the packages on the table. "Got everything for the crib. Should be able to start building it tomorrow evening." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small paper-wrapped bundle. "And this is for you." Penelope took it, surprised. "For me?" "Matthew, you didn't need to. It's nothing elaborate," he said quickly. "Just saw it and thought of you." She unwrapped the paper to find a beautiful bone comb for her hair, inlaid with small pieces of turquoise in a delicate pattern. "Oh," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "It's lovely." "The turquoise reminded me of your eyes," Matthew said, then immediately looked as if he wished he could take the words back. "I mean it's practical too, for your hair." Penelope smiled, touched by both the gift and his embarrassment. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. Matthew finally broke the silence. "There's talk of a social in 2 weeks' time," he said. "At the schoolhouse in town. Dance, picnic, that sort of thing. Mr. Rankin always gives the hands the day off if they want to attend." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Thought you and Emma might enjoy getting off the ranch for a day, meeting some of the other families in the area." "That sounds wonderful," Penelope said. "I haven't been to a social since before Emma was born." "Good. That's good." Matthew nodded, seeming relieved. "I could drive you in the buckboard if you'd like. Be more comfortable for you and Emma than riding." "I'd appreciate that," Penelope said, wondering if this was his way of asking to escort her specifically, or simply offering transportation as he would to anyone on the ranch. "Well, I should let you rest," Matthew said, backing toward the door. "Need to unpack the rest of the supplies." After he left, Penelope held the comb to her chest, a conflicted feeling washing over her. It had been just 2 months since Thomas died. Was it disrespectful to his memory that her heart seemed to be opening to another man so soon? Or was it simply the natural response to kindness after trauma? She had no answers, but as she placed the comb carefully on her dresser, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her at the thought of Matthew Blackwood's thoughtful gift. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Matthew worked on Emma's crib in the evenings, often staying late into the night to finish the detailed carving he insisted on adding to the headboard. Penelope would sit with him after Emma was asleep, sometimes mending clothes by the fire, other times just talking as he worked. She learned more about his past, how he'd studied engineering at a school in Philadelphia before the war interrupted his education, how he'd served as a mapmaker for the Union Army, and how he'd drifted west afterward, unable to settle back into his old life. In turn, she told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had valued education for his daughters as well as his sons. She spoke of meeting Thomas at a church social, their courtship, and their dreams of building a new life in Montana. "He would have liked it here," she said one evening, watching as Matthew carefully sanded the crib rails. Thomas always talked about wide, open spaces, room to breathe. Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's what draws many of us out here, that sense of possibility. Yes, Penelope agreed. Possibility. The crib was finished 3 days before the social. Matthew brought it to the cabin in the evening, assembled it in the small bedroom, and placed the new mattress he'd ordered from Fort Benton inside. "It's beautiful," Penelope said, running her hand over the smooth wood. He had carved a pattern of stars and moons into the headboard, with Emma's initials in the center. "She'll sleep in it for years." "That's the idea," Matthew said, watching as she laid Emma in the crib for the first time. "Built it sturdy enough to last." The words hung between them. Built to last, like he expected them to stay, like he was investing in their future here. Emma immediately tried to pull herself up on the rails, making both adults laugh. "She approves," Penelope said. "High praise indeed," Matthew replied, gently touching Emma's head. "Sleep well, little star." The tenderness in his voice made Penelope's throat tighten with emotion. She walked him to the door afterward, a new sense of awareness between them. "Thank you, Matthew, for everything." He nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. "Good night, Penny." The morning of the social dawned clear and warm. Penelope dressed Emma in her best gown, one of the few items she'd salvaged from the wagon, and herself in a simple blue dress that she'd freshly pressed the day before. She pinned her hair up with Matthew's comb, allowing a few curls to frame her face. When Matthew arrived with the buckboard, he was wearing a clean shirt and his best pair of trousers, his usually unruly hair slicked back with water. He had even trimmed his beard. "You look nice," Penelope said as he helped her into the wagon. "So do you," he replied, his eyes lingering on the comb in her hair. "Very nice." The drive to town took just over an hour. As they approached, Penelope could see the schoolhouse decorated with bunting, and wagons and horses already gathered around the building. The sounds of a fiddle drifted through the air. "Quite a turnout," Matthew observed. "Folks don't get many chances to socialize out here. They make the most of it when they do." He helped Penelope down from the wagon, then carefully lifted Emma into her arms. Together, they walked toward the gathering. Penelope was introduced to what felt like the entire community: the shopkeeper's wife, the blacksmith and his family, the schoolteacher, and numerous ranchers and farmers from the surrounding area. Everyone was curious about the new cook at the Lazy R, and Penelope found herself telling her story many times over throughout it all. Matthew stayed close by, bringing her lemonade, introducing her to people he knew, and occasionally taking Emma to give Penelope's arms a rest. The little girl seemed to delight in the attention, babbling happily at everyone who spoke to her. After the picnic lunch, the dancing began in earnest. Matthew had just returned with fresh lemonade when the fiddler struck up a lively reel. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Penelope hesitated. "I should stay with Emma, I'll take her," Mrs. Peterson interjected, appearing beside them. "Go on, you two. Young folks should be dancing." Before Penelope could protest further, Emma was whisked away by Mrs. Peterson, who was already cooing to her about watching the dancers. Matthew offered his hand, and Penelope took it, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. He placed his other hand lightly at her waist, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "I should warn you," he said as they began to move with the music, "I'm not much of a dancer." "You're doing fine," Penelope assured him, though in truth he was a bit stiff. "Just relax." As the dance continued, Matthew did indeed relax, and Penelope found herself enjoying the movement, the music, and his company. When the reel ended and a slower waltz began, he looked at her questioningly. "Another?" he asked. Penelope nodded, and this time when he took her in his arms, they stood closer together. She could smell the faint scent of soap and leather that she'd come to associate with him, could feel the strength in his hand at her waist. "This is nice," she said softly as they moved around the floor. "Yes," Matthew agreed, his voice equally quiet. "It is." They danced until Penelope noticed Emma beginning to fuss with Mrs. Peterson. She excused herself to tend to her daughter, and Matthew went to fetch them some food from the picnic tables. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, families started packing up to make the journey home before dark. Matthew helped Penelope back into the buckboard, securing Emma's makeshift carrier beside her. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey out. Emma fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the rocking motion of the wagon. Penelope found herself stealing glances at Matthew's profile as he drove, noticing the way the setting sun gilded his features. "Thank you for today," she said eventually. "It was wonderful to meet everyone and get away from the ranch for a while." "You were a hit," Matthew said with a smile. "Mrs. Henderson asked if you might share your apple pie recipe. I noticed you spent some time talking with Mr. Rankin and that man from Helena," Penelope observed. "Looked serious." Matthew's expression sobered slightly. "Just business. Mr. Thompson is interested in buying some of our stock for his new ranch near Helena. Wants me to deliver them next month." "Oh," Penelope said, surprised at the pang of disappointment she felt. "You'll be gone long." "Week, maybe 10 days." Matthew glanced at her. "Will you miss me?" The question was asked lightly, but his eyes were serious. Penelope felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "The ranch won't be the same without you," she said carefully. Matthew seemed to accept this indirect answer. They rode in companionable silence the rest of the way back to the Lazy R. When they arrived, the ranch was quiet, most of the hands either still in town or already retired to the bunkhouse. Matthew helped Penelope down from the wagon, then carried the sleeping Emma as they walked to the cabin. At the door, he carefully transferred Emma to Penelope's arms. Their faces were close for a moment, and Penelope hoped that he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, his hand lingering briefly on her arm. "Good night, Penny," he said softly. "Sweet dreams." "Good night, Matthew," she replied, watching as he walked back toward the bunkhouse, his tall figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. Inside the cabin, Penelope laid Emma in her new crib, then sat by the window for a long time, watching the stars and thinking about the man who had carved them into wood for her daughter. The weeks following the social brought changes to the Lazy R. A severe storm damaged part of the barn roof, keeping all hands busy with repairs. The cattle drive to Helena was postponed, much to Penelope's private relief, though she felt guilty for being glad of the delay. Matthew continued to visit her cabin most evenings, often bringing small gifts for Emma, a wooden rattle he'd carved, a soft blanket he'd commissioned from a weaver in Fort Benton, a tiny pair of moccasins traded from a passing Blackfoot hunter. Penelope began to realize that these gifts were his way of courting her, though he never spoke of his feelings directly. For her part, she found herself looking forward to his visits with increasing anticipation, planning special dishes she knew he enjoyed, and taking extra care with her appearance before he arrived. Emma, now nearly 8 months old, was pulling herself up on furniture and attempting to cruise along the edges of tables and chairs. She had developed a special smile for Matthew and would bounce excitedly whenever she heard his voice. "She'll be walking before we know it," Penelope observed one evening in early July as Emma practiced standing while holding onto the edge of a chair. "She's determined, that's for certain," Matthew agreed, watching the baby with obvious affection. "Takes after her mother that way." Penelope smiled at the compliment. "I've been thinking," she said, gathering her courage, "about Emma's future, about our future here." Matthew looked at her attentively. "Oh, Mr. Rankin mentioned that he's considering building a proper cookhouse behind the main house. Something larger than the current kitchen with better storage." She smoothed her apron nervously. "He asked if I would be interested in taking on a more permanent position as the ranch cook officially." "And are you," Matthew asked, his voice carefully neutral, "interested?" Penelope met his gaze. "I am. Emma is thriving here, I enjoy the work, and everyone has been so kind to us." She paused. "It feels like we could build a life here." Something like hope flickered in Matthew's eyes. "I think you could build a good life here, I mean." "There's just one thing," Penelope continued, her heart beating faster. "I'm not sure it's proper for a woman alone to accept such an arrangement. People might talk." Matthew set down the cup of coffee he'd been holding and leaned forward slightly. "What are you saying, Penny?" She took a deep breath. "I'm saying that Emma needs a father, and I've grown very fond of you, Matthew." The words hung between them for a long moment. Then Matthew rose from his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her hands in his. "Penelope Wright," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been trying to find the courage to tell you how I feel for weeks now. I didn't want to rush you, knowing you're still grieving Thomas. But I can't deny that I've fallen in love with you and that little girl." He nodded toward Emma, who was watching them curiously. "I'd be honored to be a father to her and a husband to you if you'll have me." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. "Are you certain?" "Taking on another man's child, a widow with nothing to her name, you have everything I could want," Matthew interrupted gently. "Kindness, courage, strength. And Emma is a blessing, not a burden." He squeezed her hands. "I love you both, Penny. I want to build a life with you if you'll let me." "Yes," Penelope whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll let you." Matthew's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it took her breath away. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, reverent kiss. When they parted, Emma gave a delighted squeal as if approving of this new development. Matthew laughed and scooped her up, holding her high above his head while she giggled. "What do you say, little star? Will you let me be your pa?" Emma's answer was to pat his cheeks with her tiny hands, which they both took as agreement. Later, after they had discussed practical matters, Matthew would speak to Reverend Collins about performing the ceremony. They would convert the second bedroom into a proper space for Emma as she grew older. Matthew would move his few possessions from the bunkhouse to the cabin. They stood together on the porch, looking out at the star-filled Montana sky. "I never expected this," Penelope said softly, leaning against Matthew's solid warmth. "When Thomas died, I thought our dreams died with him. I couldn't see a path forward." Matthew wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Life has a way of opening new doors when others close. I'm just grateful I was the one who found you that night." "So am I," Penelope said, turning to look up at him. "So very grateful." Under the vast canopy of stars, with the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them, Matthew bent to kiss her again. And Penelope knew, with absolute certainty, that they had both found exactly where they belonged. The wedding took place on a perfect August afternoon, with the mountains providing a majestic backdrop to the simple ceremony. Mr. Rankin had insisted it be held at the ranch, in the shade of the large cottonwood trees near the main house. Penelope wore a new dress of pale blue, ordered specially from Fort Benton, with Matthew's turquoise comb securing her veil. Emma, dressed in white, was held by Mrs. Peterson, who dabbed at her eyes throughout the service. All the ranch hands attended, cleaned up and solemn in their Sunday best, along with various neighbors and townspeople Penelope had met at the social. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, and when Matthew slipped a simple gold band onto Penelope's finger, his hands were steady but his eyes shone with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared, and the gathered crowd erupted in cheers as Matthew kissed his bride. The celebration afterward was joyous, with plenty of food, much of it prepared in advance by Penelope herself, despite Matthew's protests that she shouldn't have to cook for her own wedding. Music from a trio of fiddle players from town, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Mr. Rankin surprised them with a wedding gift, the deed to the cabin and the acre of land surrounding it. "Been meaning to parcel off some of this property anyway," he grumbled when Matthew tried to thank him. "Consider it payment for that irrigation system. Saved me more than the land's worth." As the stars came out and the party continued, Matthew led Penelope away from the festivities, carrying a sleepy Emma in his arms. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked as they walked toward their cabin, their home. "Perfectly happy," Penelope replied, leaning against his shoulder. "It feels like a dream." "If it is, I hope we never wake up," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to her temple. They put Emma to bed together, watching as she drifted off to sleep in the crib Matthew had made with such care. Then, with tender nervousness, they retired to their own room as husband and wife, discovering new depths to their love for each other under the canopy of a Montana night. Life settled into a new pattern. Matthew continued his work as foreman, but found time to expand and improve their small home. He built a proper porch across the front, added a lean-to kitchen at the back, and began work on a small stable for the horse and milk cow he'd acquired. Penelope's position as ranch cook became official, though with some adjustments. She now prepared breakfast and the midday meal at the ranch house, but was free to return home in the afternoons to care for Emma and their growing household. The evening meal was simpler, often left in the capable hands of Jimmy, who had shown an unexpected aptitude for cooking under Penelope's tutelage. Emma thrived under the love and attention of both parents. She took her first unaided steps just after her first birthday, toddling from Penelope to Matthew with a look of triumph on her face that had them both laughing through happy tears. As summer turned to fall, and fall gave way to the harsh Montana winter, their little family drew closer together. The cabin was warm and snug, with Matthew ensuring the firewood was always stacked high, and the roof and walls secure against the bitter cold. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Matthew often whittling new toys for Emma or working on plans for further improvements to their home, while Penelope sewed or read aloud from one of the books Matthew had purchased on his trips to Fort Benton. It was during one such evening in late January, with snow falling gently outside and Emma asleep in her crib, that Penelope set aside her mending and took Matthew's hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Matthew looked up from the design he was sketching for a proper bedroom for Emma. "What is it?" "Emma won't be the only child sleeping in this house come autumn," Penelope said softly. "We're going to have a baby." Matthew's face transformed with wonder. He set aside his work and pulled Penelope into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Our baby," Penelope confirmed, resting her head against his chest. "Emma will have a little brother or sister." "Are you happy?" Matthew asked, pulling back slightly to look into her eyes. "More than I ever thought possible," Penelope assured him. "A year ago I was lost and alone with no home and no hope. Now look at us. We have each other, this home you've built for us, our beautiful Emma, and now another child on the way." Matthew kissed her tenderly. "You gave me a family, Penny, Something I never thought I'd have again after losing my parents and sister. You and Emma. You saved me as much as I saved you." As they held each other by the fire, snow continuing to fall outside their sturdy home, Penelope reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her here. The loss and grief that had seemed insurmountable had somehow led to this new life, this new love, this new beginning. From the depths of despair on that lonely prairie night, she had found her way to this moment of perfect contentment. And as Matthew's hand came to rest protectively over her still flat stomach, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that they had both, finally, found exactly where they belonged. The years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons on the Montana frontier. The Blackwood family grew with the birth of James Robert in September 1873, followed by twins Sarah and Samuel in 1875. The cabin expanded alongside their family, with Matthew adding rooms as needed, eventually transforming the humble structure into a proper home with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house. Emma thrived as the oldest sibling, her natural protectiveness extending to her younger brothers and sister. She had inherited her mother's kind heart and her father's quick mind, eagerly absorbing everything Matthew taught her about building and problem-solving. By the age of 8, she was helping him with simple carpentry projects, her small hands surprisingly deft with hammer and saw. Matthew's position at the Lazy R evolved as well. When old Mr. Rankin finally decided to retire to California in 1876, his son showed no interest in running the ranch personally. Instead, he offered Matthew the position of ranch manager with a stake in the profits. This new arrangement gave the Blackwoods greater security and allowed Matthew to implement many of the improvements he'd been planning for years: expanded irrigation systems, better breeding stock, and more efficient buildings. Penelope continued to oversee the ranch kitchen, though now with a staff of 2 young women from town who handled most of the day-to-day cooking. Her own kitchen at home became famous throughout the county for its hospitality, with neighbors and friends often stopping by for coffee and Penelope's renowned apple pie. As Montana moved toward statehood in the late 1880s, their corner of the territory saw more settlers arrive, bringing changes both welcome and challenging. The small town near the ranch grew into a proper community with a new school, a larger church, and even a small hospital where Penelope volunteered 1 day each week, bringing food to patients and reading to those who couldn't do so themselves. Through it all, Matthew and Penelope's love for each other only deepened. The trials they faced: harsh winters, occasional drought, childhood illnesses, and the normal struggles of frontier life served to strengthen their bond rather than weaken it. Each challenge was faced together, each joy shared, each sorrow halved by the comfort of the other's presence. On the 15th anniversary of the night Matthew found Penelope and Emma stranded on the prairie, they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Emma, now nearly 16, was showing 5-year-old Catherine, their youngest, how to make a daisy chain while the boys engaged in a spirited game of catch. "Did you ever imagine this?" Penelope asked, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "That night when you heard our wagon and decided to investigate," Matthew's arm tightened around her waist. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I was just trying to do the decent thing, make sure you were safe for the night. I never expected to find my entire future waiting for me in that broken-down wagon." Penelope smiled, turning to look up at the face she knew better than her own, still handsome despite the lines that time had etched around his eyes and mouth, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Matthew asked, puzzled. "For building us a place to belong. For making a home for me and Emma when we had nothing. For being the man you are." Matthew bent to kiss her, still with the same tenderness as their first kiss all those years ago. "You're the one who made it a home, Penny. You filled it with love and laughter and purpose." As the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Penelope thought about the long, winding journey that had brought them here. The grief and loss that had seemed unbearable had somehow been the beginning of a new and beautiful chapter. "Mama, Papa, come see what I made," Catherine called, running toward them with her chain of daisies. Hand in hand, Matthew and Penelope went to admire their daughter's creation, surrounded by the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the family, the love, and the life they had created from what once seemed like nothing but despair and uncertainty. Here, on this patch of Montana earth, they had found exactly where they belonged, together,